So welcome back for part 5 of Why We Lecture and Why We Shouldn't. This is Eric Salahub here, and if you are jumping in on part 4, find part 1 and start there. That's my suggestion. So we finished part 3 talking about lecture discussion and lecture storytelling, and we ended with this quote from my hero, Dr. Terry Doyle: "The person who does the work does the learning." If you want your students to learn, maybe you want them to do the work outside of class so that they can have productive discussions in class, or maybe you want them to do the work so that they can actually craft their own stories about the content and the skills and the connections to their real lives. So let's move on and look at one last slate of reasons why we lecture. And these aren't saved for the end because they're not important. They are pretty important. Teaching is difficult, and the control over the chaos that a lecture provides helps us cope with the task of teaching. I've been a teacher for more than 25 years. It's still difficult, but when I started, this reason would have definitely been a plus for me. I really struggled with the fear of what could happen in class that I wasn't ready for. And so I spent a lot of time crafting very careful lectures so I could try to make sure that I was in control of what was happening, out of fear that students would either ask a question that I didn't know the answer to, or things would spin out of control. And so lecturing allows us to create this order and predictability in the classroom, and that can be comforting for us, and it can certainly also be comforting for students. And I don't have an answer. I don't have a slide with a critique of this. I think this is a meaningful reason to lecture for the teacher. But I don't think this is a good reason to lecture in terms of student learning. And I don't know what to do about that. I am still a shy introvert who simply now knows after 25 years of teaching that nothing bad is going to happen in class. And if I don't know the answer, that's okay. And so it has taken me a long time to develop the humility to be okay going into class and just dealing with whatever happens. I also have spent 15 or 20 years of my 25 years as a teacher lecturing, and so I know the content really well of those classes that I teach. I pretty much know there is nothing a student is going to ask in class that I haven't heard before. And so that, I can now move away from lectures and not be so afraid of losing control. But if you're a new teacher, I don't know what to tell you because I learned a lot of my content and developed the skills I have as a philosophy teacher lecturing. The act of teaching helped me learn a lot over those years. But I am not going to give you the advice, if you're a new teacher, to spend 5 years lecturing just so then that you can move away from something that isn't effective to help students learn. I'm going to suggest that you don't learn bad habits only to then later have to break them. Unfortunately for me, I am never going to be a full member of the active learning paradigm. I can be an adopter of that paradigm, but I'm a lecturer at heart. I've spent all of my career as a lecturer, or most of it. That is my fallback. And so I am not going to suggest that you saddle yourself with those bad habits. It will be difficult as a new teacher to go in and do something other than lecture. I'm still going to suggest that it's better to be a novice and someone who's not good at active learning than to spend a whole bunch of time becoming proficient or mastering a skill, lecturing, that I ultimately don't think is really helpful for students compared to other things you might do. Nonetheless, I do recognize that this is a powerful emotional reason for teachers. Here's another one. We think students expect lectures. We think students prefer lectures. We hear that students enjoy lectures. And we also hear or believe that students won't participate or do well in active learning activities. They don't want to talk in class. They certainly don't want to work in groups. They don't want to be put on the spot to present out. They want to sit there and have us teach them. And so before I click to the next slide, which is going to offer some pushback, I'll just let you know I just read a study, and it's not in this presentation because I just read it and I already built this. But it's in Inside Higher Ed, and so if you email me, I will point you to this article. It just came out of Harvard in physics, and they said that, yeah, students do actually prefer lectures slightly more than active learning. That's what they like, that's what they want. I mean, they don't hate active learning, but they actually did like lectures. They preferred them. They rated their teachers as better teachers when the teachers were lecturing. I'm not sure that study would apply to all students, but I think we know that some students do prefer lectures, and they definitely expect lectures. I mean, even if they don't like them, they expect it because they're a part of the paradigm too. I was talking to some high school teacher colleagues a few weeks ago, and I asked them about active learning, because I think we here at the college level, that high schools are much more into active learning, getting students to do the work. And so I asked 60 high school teachers that are also teaching college classes. And a few of them said something that made me chuckle, but it speaks to this power of this paradigm. They said, yeah, we do more active learning, but once we know our students are going to college, we tell them that in college you're not going to get this, so get prepared for a lecture. So again, they're even telling their students, we know that lectures aren't good, and that's why we're doing active learning, but you better learn to sit through those boring lectures, because that's what you're going to get when you go to college. And I know that a lot of my community colleagues, a lot of my colleagues here at Front Range or at other community colleges are going to say, well, we know lectures aren't really that good, but we're training students to go to the university, and they're going to need to learn to sit through hour-long lectures and take notes. So even though I don't think those are really that great, I am doing my due diligence by prepping students to sit through the continuous exposition by a lecture when they get to CSU or CU or wherever they're going. And so, I don't know. You can tell me what you think about this, or you can think about it yourselves. And, I am not into the customer attitude about students, but, to the extent that we're expected to give students what they expect and what they want, this is probably relevant to think about. Graham Gibbs, I mentioned in part 1, maybe part 2. This is from Gibbs' 20 Terrible Reasons to Lecture. Gibbs is citing the Hale Report, and this was from the 1960s. He says that in 7 teaching methods, lectures were ranked last for efficiency, 5th out of 7 for enjoyment, but 1st for frequency. So there's at least some evidence that not all students like lectures. Students realized that they weren't efficient and they didn't enjoy them, but that's what they got most of the time. And Gibbs is also citing Leash from 1970, and this was from the UK. In 10 colleges of education and several universities, students did not like lectures. They liked other things, but they had a general distaste for lectures. And this is from me to you. It's not cited because it's me. I'm not sure I care what students prefer. I am convinced that most students have no idea what's best for them in terms of learning. And so, do we cater to students' whims and preferences, or do we actually help students learn? I am not sure that what students like or prefer or find easy is actually what's best for them. And so, what are we to do? I did ask my own students, and this is one of my students who I am quoting. I asked them to think about learning at the beginning of the semester, and I didn't actually ask my students what's the worst thing about school, but this student, in her response to a prompt about learning, wrote this. What's the worst thing about school? Having to sit down from early in the morning till late in the afternoon hearing lecture after lecture. After a while, they begin to bleed together, and you're studying harder each night just so you can doodle through a lecture. It's completely one-sided, creating a great divide between students and the knowledge they're trying to absorb. I thought this was fairly profound from a 100 level philosophy student on, this was after the first day of class. I will point out that she speaks to this power divide, and she clearly is recognizing that the person at the front of the room, it's not just that I'm the important one when I'm up there, but the knowledge to her is separated in this way. And I also had many other students in class talk about death by PowerPoint and how boring lectures are and how hard it is to stay awake. And at least my own students, once I actually let them know that there's something other than lectures, often admit, yeah, they're easy and that's why they like them, but that, man, they're boring and hard to sit through. Well, what does brain science tell us? I mean, one of the reasons we shouldn't lecture, and I've alluded to it several times, is it just doesn't attune with the way learning actually happens in the brain. Learning is not metaphorical. Learning is an actual physical process that is happening in your brain. If you want to see something really cool, since you're in YouTube, once we're done with this part of this presentation, look up, Google, or go to YouTube and search for neurons growing and watch a video. I mean, it's fascinating, and that's literally learning happening in front of your eyes. Learning is formation of neurons, strengthening of neurons, interconnecting neural networks, the ability to recall and rewrite and encode memories and use them. And those things are all actual physical processes that are happening in the brain. It's not mystical vapors, right? Referring back to something I said, I think, in part 2. It's about how to memorize and how to recall memories and practice. And guess what? This is why quizzing to mastery is so useful, because it's forcing students to recall over and over and over. And maybe if they do, they can actually start making connections between this isolated set of memories that are relevant to your class and everything else they know. And once they do that, you know, they can recall those memories easier. And so one of the reasons that lectures are problematic is there's just not a lot of evidence that hearing someone talk or watching someone do something helps you learn, because learning is an active process in the brain. There is actually a lot of evidence that there is something better than lecturing. It's active learning. And so I won't talk about these two meta-analyses, both done in the early 2000s, 2004 and 2006. But there's evidence that doing things other than lecture, even just taking 5 minutes out of your lecture to let students do something, has been shown to be effective at helping students learn more. I mean, heck, there's a study. Someone taught 2 classes identically, both lecture classes in big lecture halls, and she only did one thing different with the experimental group. She only had them do a pre-test before her lecture. The other group just got the lecture. The only difference was one group did a pre-test, which they did horrible on because they didn't know anything, and the other group just got the lecture. Just implementing the pre-test as an active learning strategy helped that section of her class do better on the exams. And that's just the tip of the iceberg to some of the research in the power of active learning. But the problem is we don't understand anything other than lecture, right? Because designing and developing learning activities that aren't about lecture, it requires time and knowledge and skills that I just don't have. Maybe you have a degree in education, or maybe you were a high school teacher before you came to college and taught. But most people I know have never had training in how to be a teacher. They don't know anything about course design or instructional design or theories of learning or the psychology of learning or how the brain works or neuropsychology or, we just don't know. And why would we? Because we're philosophers or welders or biologists or EMTs or holistic health practitioners. I mean, you name it. And so I really am suggesting that there's a set of skills that you need in order to move away from doing the one thing that you actually are good at, which is lecturing. I mean, you spend a lot of time in school learning what to teach, but probably not how to teach it, and your exposure to how to teach it was by example, and more than likely, most of your teachers were lecturers. And so we don't do something different because we don't know anything other than lecturing. And this is a significant challenge. And I'm hoping that when you watch this and realize that this is true to the extent that it is for you, you're going to reach out to an instructional coach or think about instructional design or backwards design, or talk to me about watching some more videos on backwards design and active learning. Hint, hint, that's really why I'm here, to engage you, to maybe want to learn more about doing something different. I'm going to give you a quote from John Dewey, and this is from 1916. Philosopher, psychologist, you probably heard of Dewey. I'm not going to be able to read this with the eloquence that Dewey would, but I'll try to hit the highlights of what he's saying here. He says this: why is it that in spite of the fact that teaching by pouring in, learning by passive absorption are universally condemned, that they are still so entrenched in practice? That education is not an affair of telling and being told, but an active, constructive process is a principle almost generally violated in practice as conceded in theory. Is not this deplorable situation due to the fact that the doctrine is itself merely told? And what I love about this quote is it's more than 100 years ago, and Dewey is talking about exactly what we're talking about right now. He said back then everyone knew that lectures were not helpful, right? Telling and being told. He realized back then, and he thought it was clear that almost every educator knew, that learning is an active, constructive process. And he said what? Even though everybody knows that, it's violated all the time. Why? Because all we do is talk about it. We never actually learn how to do something different. Don't let this happen to you. I am here. That's me. I'm actually here, and I've got a challenge for you. I want you to actually do something. You've sat through, literally, more than an hour of lecture about moving away from lecture, about doing something different. I want you to actually set a goal for yourself, and let me help hold you accountable for that goal. So I would really love for you to email me and tell me a goal. I would like to lecture less. I would like to learn more about active learning. I would like to try to encourage my students to do meaningful homework. I'd like to actually keep track of how much time I'm lecturing, or if I'm really doing lecture discussion. Come up with a goal, something measurable that you could hold yourself accountable to, and reach out and let me know, and I will help hold you accountable to that goal. So we're going to pause here and come back and look at the last section with some specific helpful tips on how you can actually move away from lecturing. And so when you pause, maybe you can actually take my challenge and write about that and send it to me.